Well, as we approach the 2020 election cycle, I mean, it's in full swing for the Democrats. We're getting there for the Republicans. Some really interesting polling was done by local entrepreneur and 2018 gubernatorial candidate Greg Orman in cohesion with the Real Clear Politics group. So, Greg, there was a lot that stood out to me. First off, thank you for joining us in studio.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So, take us through this poll. There's a couple of things that stood out to me in particular. Number one was that 76% agree that the real struggle for America is not between Republicans and Democrats, but instead it's between mainstream America and the ruling political elites. I saw that and I said, maybe we've got this all wrong. Maybe Trump doesn't want to face Bernie Sanders because Bernie Sanders, on the total opposite side of the aisle, is running a similar campaign to Donald Trump, which is us versus the elites. Is that fair?
You know, I think they are very similar candidates in that regard. And in fact, this was something that in 2015 was really a revelation for the media when they went to New Hampshire and they asked New Hampshire independents who they were going to vote for. And they said, you know, either Trump or Sanders. Mm-hmm. And people didn't realize how could you be choosing between a Democrat and a Republican?
Yeah.
Well, in the minds of many of Americans, that's not the choice. The choice is between the ruling elite and the political establishment and someone who's more anti-systemic and will re-empower the American people.
So when I look at some of the other headlines here, 85% believe, and this was a nationwide poll, correct?
It was nationwide, 2,180 people.
Okay.
It was a representative sampling. In fact, if you look at who the people voted for in the presidential contest in 2016, 44% of them voted for Hillary Clinton, 42% for Donald Trump. It was a very representative sample.
Okay, so 85% in this poll that you guys did with Real Clear Politics believe the power of ordinary people to control their country is getting weaker every day as political elites fight to protect their own power. What does this tell you as we enter a 2020 election year and cycle that's, very confusing right now on the Democrat side, and as we get closer to the general campaign as well this summer and this fall? What does a number like that tell you about what the conversation is going to be in the coming weeks and months?
Well, first, I think it's remarkable that there's that much consensus in this political environment where we seem so polarized. The American people clearly agree on that. I think the candidates are going to have messaging. The ones that are going to resonate are going to have messaging that's really oriented around fixing our broken and corrupt political system first and foremost, before they start addressing all the other issues that Americans are concerned about. In fact, in our polling, the number one issue, and we tested 25 issues, the number one issue was government ethics and corruption. And I think candidates are going to have messaging and plans that really address those issues.
Is that term limits? Is it getting money out of the election cycle process when Michael Bloomberg spends $400 million? Now, it's his own money. God bless him. He has the money. But, where does that begin, and what do you think that the messaging has to be about specifically?
Well, if I were Bloomberg, first off, I would say it's a hell of a lot better to buy an election than to be bought.
Yeah.
And I think the American people would generally agree with that. We looked at a number of reform proposals. The ones that tested the highest, 86% of Americans would act tough reforms to close the revolving door between Congress and congressional staffer and lobbyist.
Okay.
86% would force full disclosure of dark money campaign spending, and 85% would actually vote to prohibit lobbyists from making campaign contributions or bundling contributions on behalf of candidates. I think the American people are very clearly saying our government is not for sale.
That's a great point. Greg Orman is joining us, local entrepreneur, ran for governor back in 2018 as an independent, joining us on KCMO about a recent polling process he went through with Real Clear Politics. In this poll as well, Greg, 87% say that political rancor is tearing the country apart. I don't even think that's a question right now. Republican or Democrat, people believe that. What's the answer to that? Because it seems like as much as people say it's tearing us apart, people want the candidate who's going to be a fighter and who's going to rip apart the other side. So what do you do?
Well, it's interesting. In our polling, 60% of the people we polled actually disagreed with that statement. They said they want a candidate who will compromise with the other side. 40% said we want one that's going to fight for our values no matter what. So I think there is a growing sense that what's happened is this political partisanship has created an environment where we're not solving problems, and that's leaving the American people behind. If you look at median household income over the last 20 years, it's barely budged in America, and yet in 2018, the 5 wealthiest counties in America now all touched Washington, D.C.
Wow.
And so when you think about it, the American people view this as a system that's leaving them behind, that's not solving problems, and ultimately, while there is a lot of partisanship and a lot of rancor, they really want progress on key issues, but they don't think that's going to happen until we fix our broken political system.
So then, Greg, to that point, though, in the way the system is set up, it's very difficult to win a primary saying, I'll work with the other side. And then, it's one thing if you get to a general to say it might work, although I'm not sure it would. But you can't win a primary like that, right? So is it ranked choice voting? What changes that system?
Well, I am a huge advocate for ranked choice voting. In fact, the week before the presidential election in 2016, I was up in Maine doing media and campaigning for ranked choice voting in Maine. And so I do believe that is one of the fixes to our
And just take people through, a summary of it.
Ranked choice voting is a real simple process. The Democrats in Kansas are going to apply it in their presidential caucus this year. But you go to the ballot box, and if there are 4 candidates on the ballot, you get to list your first choice, second choice, third choice, etc. If your candidate who is your first choice isn't one of the top 2 vote getters, your votes are reallocated to your second choice. And no one wins unless they get 50% of the total votes. And so what this process does is it forces candidates to compete for second place votes, which means you can't just appeal to a small base of voters. You have to broaden your appeal. And it also means you get punished for negative campaigning, because if you attack somebody and then expect their voters to select you as their second choice, it's unlikely going to happen.
That's it's really interesting. It's something that we've talked about on the show, and I think it's getting more traction, as you're pointing out. Greg, as you look back on this study that you guys did with Real Clear Politics, 2,000 voters, basically half Trump, half Hillary from 16. What have we not touched on yet that you think will be potentially a defining part of what the 2020 election cycle is about?
Well, it's interesting because ultimately the 2020 election, as you've mentioned, is really shaping up to be an issue, a race between Donald Trump on the one hand and either an anti-establishment candidate or very much an establishment candidate on the other hand. And I do believe that the person who wins the presidential contest tends to be the person who is the most inspiring. Mm-hmm. And so my suspicion is, while there's a lot of belief that certain candidates won't win a general election against President Trump, I think it gets very dangerous when we start to try to pick who we should vote for on the basis of who can win, because that's not inspiring.
Yeah.
And that's not inspiring to the American people, and that's really what they're looking for, and we see it in our numbers, is not only are they anti-systemic, but they want a candidate who's going to look to the future and is going to say, here's what we're going to do to ultimately help the American dream become real again for every American who's willing to work to achieve it.
Well, this is a really interesting poll, Greg. I'm glad we were able to touch base on it. Greg Orman, local entrepreneur, ran for governor back in 2018 as an independent. Really good stuff here. Greg, we appreciate you coming on the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, happy to be here.